Hi, my name is Sahil. I am actually from Nairobi, Kenya, and I came to India, I think, in 2017 for film school. Before that, I was engaging with film, I was engaging with theater and stuff. And there were very human stories that I was quite interested in. And finally, like after 2 years of film school in India, I don't know if I found a voice yet, but I'm engaging with stories that are mostly to do with marginalized communities, and that's very exciting for me. Um, and I'm a lot excited about the idea and the archetypes that mythology has created for us, and just to see how we can reinterpret them like with the current context. So that's what defines a lot of the work that I'm also working with at the moment. And yeah,
In your experience as a journalist and in theater,
yeah,
you have two different positions. In journalism, we are on the outside looking into the events or looking around us, but we're not actual participants. We don't
yeah,
comment. We just comment, but we're not the actors. But in theater, you're right in the center of the production. So
yeah.
how do these two positions come into play when you're doing your own films?
So it's very interesting. I practiced journalism for about, I think, 3 years. 3 years I worked in radio and for a daily newspaper. And this was back in Nairobi. And I mean, I wasn't covering the current events and stuff. I was actually more concentrated towards the happenings of the South Asian community based in Nairobi and stuff, right? So it was more of that perspective. Um, and when we talk about journalism, like when we were in school, we engaged in a lot of projects and stuff, right? And they're often known as the fourth pillar of society, which is, I mean, it gave me a lot of motivation to actually pursue human interest stories and what
Right.
it really means to live a life per se, with whatever political, social, cultural environment that one is placed in. And like you're right, like you have to be objective to be able to cover those stories and stuff. But what that did for me was to give an insight in insight about the society that we actually live in. And then when theater came into play, it was again a very interesting journey because now you're a teller of the story. And when you become a teller of a story, it's very subjective. So you're not being objective anymore. You're putting out a point of view. And that a lot of my subjectivity was derived from the stories that I experienced while practicing journalism, right? Where during journalism, what I couldn't do was there's a particular point of view that I had over things. I had an opinion. My politics led me to have a say in my opinion per se, but I couldn't put it out there because you gotta be objective. Theater gave me that one closer push to telling stories the way I saw stuff. Um, and when it came to film, theater was very. I still love and practice theater because that's a very different medium. And it's a very exciting medium. And it's a completely different discipline as compared to cinema, where in cinema we have the introduction and of the camera, like we have a lens, right? And that entire discipline was so different. But journalism as well as theater, practicing in both these fields really defined my voice in cinema. It was a great amalgamation of these two disciplines that possibly I feel like sort of developed what I'm trying to say in a more nuanced, in a more human, in a more dramatic human. So it's a very interesting balance that these two disciplines really gave me. And yeah, that also defines the processes that I go through with my film, like in terms of research, in terms of where the story is coming from, how all of that is taking place, and then what is my take on it, right? And then we bring in the camera, and then we figure out what to do with it, and it's very exciting. So that's how these two disciplines really came into play for me. in making cinema per se.
Yeah. And there's a spontaneity and a compulsion to be in the moment in both theater and journalism, which is not there in the films. You have slight leeway in doing retakes, and if
Yeah.
something is not perfect. So, is that a luxury that you enjoy, which is not there in the other two forms?
So that's the thing, right? There's such inherently different disciplines,
Mhm.
right? When you're practicing journalism, it's a completely different point of view. Like what you're set out to do, your aim is very different, right? But when we talk about theater, which is more of a fictional storytelling form, like cinema, um, theater again has a different adrenaline attached to it, right? Because you put in months and months of rehearsal to be able to create that one moment on stage. And it's live and it's alive and it's breathing people. You're getting breathing people reacting to you in that moment. And that's that is another interesting high sort of thing where you're like, okay, this is in the moment. But leading to that moment, there's been months of rehearsals that have gone into, right? Compared to cinema where you do have the luxury of another take. But again, it's such a financially sensitive medium where you're constantly under pressure because you'll never have enough time to shoot the film the way you want. You're always going to have like 4 days or 3 days. You wish you could have 3 more days and stuff, right? And so you retake, and finally you get it and stuff. So it's very similar of the high when you hit that beat or hit that moment in theater as well as cinema, because both mediums in terms of striving for they're both constructed towards, I mean, ideally, like I said before, they're both storytelling mediums, they're both fictional storytelling mediums, but they're all catered towards creating this one moment, be it on stage or be it on cinema. And they both have equal amounts of work that go into, right? So
Yeah.
in comparison, like I wouldn't pick one or the other. But they're both very different. But the purpose is to still move people and tell a story from your point of view. So I don't know if that
Right.
answers it, but yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Coming to your movie, Shikandi, Sahil,
Yes.
what made you choose? I mean, you said you were interested in telling stories of the disenfranchised or the marginalized,
Yeah.
but why this particular theme? Was there? What was it? Something that you saw or you experienced or
Yeah.
you have thought about or you support?
Yeah. So it's again it's a very interesting story. So you live in Bombay, right?
Bangalore.
Bangalore, right? Have you been to Bombay?
Yeah, I've lived in Bombay for a few years.
Yeah. Oh, great. So you'll figure, so because there's context to this story, like so
So,
um you know the Western Express Highway, right?
yeah, yeah.
So I was staying in Andheri, and every day I had to go through the Western Express Highway to go to Film City for work and stuff, right? So there was this one time where I took an auto and I went through, and there's the RA junction, which is full of traffic all the time. So you have to wait at least 4 or 5 minutes before
Right.
before the lights go green, and then you clear up and stuff. And so one day my auto waited there, and there was a member of the transgender community in India who came to me, and uh, so I gave her some money, and she returned 5 rupees back. So I was
Right.
like, wait a minute, like this has never happened to me. Like, why do you do this? And she said something that really moves me even till today. She's like, I don't want anyone to give me money with bad intention. Right. And I was
Right.
like, that was really moving for me. And so I stopped the auto. And this is where your journalistic instinct kicks in. And you're like, tell me your story. I want to know your story. And so we sat on that day for about 3 to 4 hours just discussing our lives. And that was sort of the starting point where I was like, okay, I'm just really moved by this entire experience of human interaction between two humans. And there's definitely something that I wanted to explore. That happened a year before I actually even started thinking about a film like Shikandi. So another thing that experience stayed there at the back of my mind. And then about a year later, I saw this wonderful film by Rituparna Ghosh, who's no more. They made a film called Chitrangada, The Crowning Wish, which was one of his second last films. And it moved me again to a core, like it really just had some imprint in my life and stuff. So about a few months later, Chitrangada is about this princess who is very masculine in the eyes of society. And so to adhere to a particular male gaze, she changes herself. And it was an inherent queer story that really moved me, and how Rituparna Ghosh did it in that film. I was like, okay, this is an interesting format, and it really did touch me. So again, a couple of months later, I wanted to engage in mythology, and I wanted to engage mythology from the lens of marginalized communities. And I was particularly interested in queer representation in mythology, as we know. And the most popular character that comes up in the forefront when you talk about queer representation in our myths, in our epics, is of Shikandi. And so when I read up that character, and that's the time, that conversation that I had with Anushka. Her name is Anushka, the trans woman I met about a year ago, a year and a half ago, and they just sort of merged in my head. I was like, okay, this is an interesting starting point to like probably explore this in the cinematic form. And after that happened, and then I started to collaborate with people from the community to be able to make and write and tell an authentic story. So that was the process. Yeah.
And how do we get entry into these communities as storytellers? I mean, is there acceptance? Is empathy enough for us to belong? Or how do we look at their story? Are we still looking from an outsider inside, or how do we approach it
Yeah.
in an honest way? I mean,
I love this question because I've engaged in this entire process, right? Um, the first thing that I'd like to put out there, and I keep telling everyone about it, who is wanting to tell the story of a community that you do not belong to, right? Um, I mean, the ideal thing is, and I strongly believe, is like you have no right to tell somebody else's story if you're not from that community. However, if we as storytellers are such hungry people, and if something moves us, we'd like to tell that story. And the answer to that is, of course, you can tell this story, but the only way to tell the story is through collaboration. Like, there is no other way to tell their story without them, whichever community you're talking about, right? So it is of vital importance that if you want, because otherwise, um, at a mere level of empathy, you will not get honesty, you will not get authentic representation, because it's always going to be an outsider's gaze into a community if you merely come from a place of empathy. But if you go beyond empathy and transform this empathy into collaboration, that's the time you'll really get a full, well-rounded representation of a particular community and the story of a community that you're telling. And that's the only way. Like, if you're not willing to collaborate, then you do not have the right to tell that community story. So that's where I stand. Yeah.
wonderful. In this particular film, what did they bring to the film apart from their story?
Yeah.
In terms of filmmaking, what was their role, Sahil?
Okay. So you've seen the film. Have you? Yeah. So all the members, like especially the two main members of the Gharana of the space that we show, they're trans actors. So they are from the community, and so I'll tell you about the process we went through while making this film. And this was about what 3 years ago. Like we made this film in 2019. Um, we I was very particular about the fact that if we're having a story about the trans community in India, they have to be played by trans people. There's no other way out, right? And there's no other way of doing it because it's not anyone else's story. It's their story to tell. And so we were very lucky to have Vicky Ji and Madhuri Ji join the cast in. So here's the thing, right? Where there's so many movies and there's so many stories out there in the visual medium that merely make these characters based on pure tokenism, right? Where they're like, okay, they're this character, it might have a different fate, it might have not a happy fate, it might end up somewhere else. They're perceived as they're not well represented, honestly, right? The characters don't have agency. They have it's merely an image to create sensation, and you find people from any particular community that's marginalized there for that sake. And that again goes back to my point where you're not collaborating and you're looking at it from the outside. However, with Shikandi, we were very particular about the fact that it's their story. They need to tell it. And these are characters who have agency. These are fully fledged characters with arcs, right? Who have found a space for themselves in this world. They're reclaiming space. They're reclaiming a space at the table to speak. Right. So apart from the actors, there was huge back and forth on the script with very good friends of mine who are from the community. Like, this is not my story to tell. Is this okay? What else do you think should be there and stuff? Right. And so there's a constant back and forth. And I keep emphasizing that it's not my story to say, it's not my story to tell, it's theirs. And that was so wonderful. And before we started the shoot and stuff, we did a couple of days of sensitizing and on how to address people on a set that is making a queer film. Right? There are particular ways, there are particular terms that you need to be sensitized about when you're making a film like this. And once that was out of the way, it was the most beautiful experiences that we had on set. And yeah, I mean, like, I just remember like these beautiful anecdotes, and it's event, when your what your intention is,
Yes.
and how you make that intention come to fruition by collaborating. I keep going back to that word because it's so important. By collaborating and by collaborating, and you'll see the joys and the wonders it does to a film set. Like, for me, the end product wasn't as important as the process was of making this film. Like, whatever the end product would be, whatever the film would be. And I can so proudly say that the process, we had so much fun in the process that we take back this experience with us, right? And the aim, again, for a film like this to be made was, I mean, obviously there is the need of a storyteller to make a story and stuff. But for me, what was of priority was how can people who are in this film can knock on doors outside and ask for work because they have credibility of a film under their belt and they're actors. And they are trans actors who deserve work. Right. And it happened. They were able to knock on doors. There were opportunities that came their way. And that's honestly the win of the film, like whatever the film is. So it's that. It's about uplifting, it's about collaborating, and just in its truest sense, and not what a surface level understanding of upliftment means.
Right. Yeah, so in some of the films and shows from the West where we have of this community of transgenders and other LGBT
Yes,
community, the portrayal is one of extreme normality and acceptance in the society. Like, for instance, Heartstoppers and things.
yes,
I mean, you wouldn't know them to be anything different from any other relationship. It's not seen as something
yeah,
of something unusual.
yes,
Yes, in India, we still they're not yet mainstream, and audiences for these films are still different. Whereas in the West, those films are or shows are mainstream, watched by everyone.
yeah.
So, is India far behind in this in terms of acceptance and our the way we are as a society?
Uh,
And do you think it's
yeah,
going to change very quickly or?
yeah. So, so here's the thing, right? Like I also have an issue when relationship, like queer relationships, are normalized. So I'll tell you why. So the idea of it being normal comes from a very heteronormative society, right? Where there is a male and a female who set the bar of what a relationship should be. Like a cis heterosexual couple is the barometer of what society should be, right? And so, what most of
Mhm.
the shows, not the ones that you mentioned, but there are so many others which are really like it has to like adhere to this norm. And so also normalizing
Mhm.
it is quite problematic in that sense. However, it's about creating your space for the type of relationships that you want to have. Like
Mhm.
that's the conversation that we as a society should be having. Said
Right.
that, now having said that, India in a sense is plagued by very different issues at the moment, right? And especially with
Mhm.
marginalized communities. And it's not just the queer communities, it's religious minorities, it is caste minorities. And we're communities who do not see an upward mobility at the moment, unfortunately. However, um, there is agitation, there is solidarity. So there's this lovely, I love this. She's a trans Dalit activist called Grace Bun, right? And I'm going to paraphrase, but she's and I love, and this is what I believe in also, and she words it very beautifully. I wouldn't be able to remember the exact words, but she basically talks about like queer lives. Sorry about that. There is no liberation for a particular community unless all marginalized communities get together, rally together, and liberate. It's the only way to do that. Like all marginalized communities need to come together to find liberation and have a say and get a table, I'll get a chair at the table for conversation and reclaim space. Right. And
Mhm.
that is slowly happening, which is a great thing where communities, marginalized communities, are slowly coming together. Again, in a very idealistic way, but in one way or another, that is happening, right? If, yeah, and like the marriage equality Supreme Court debate is a great step. The fact that that is happening, a
Mhm.
conversation with regards to that is taking place, is a step forward in this long fight
Mhm.
where marginalized communities were coming together to be able to make our voices heard and obtain equity and equality.
Mhm. So, in your story, like in many personal stories, I guess the first point of confrontation is the parental family acceptance. So, that's the first block which they face.
Yeah,
So, is that, I mean, from if you take the Mahabharata, do you see any parallels between this and Shikandi?
Um, I mean, yeah, like right from the beginning, right? Like, um, the father doesn't accept her identity, like whatever the gender that she's been assigned at birth, he completely strips her away of that. And that is also a huge part of her conflict, where she comes from. And it's that gender dysphoria that she's constantly battling. I mean, right in the beginning of the story, it's there. And there are so many other instances, like, and not just in the queer tales of Mahabharata, but even what parents do to their kids in the other segments of the story, right? This entire idea of generational trauma is real, and it needs to be addressed, and not just in queer stories per se. It is prominent in queer stories because it's unfortunately that it's a trending topic, and it's become a bit tokenistic at the moment, where people are not exploring honest experiences. And but yeah, like, it's there, it's right at the beginning of the story. Like, she's made to be somebody else who she doesn't identify as, unfortunately. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sahil, for this lovely conversation.
Thank
And
you.
it's a very short conversation, but it's something that is psychologically, socially, politically very important to many young kids of today.
Yes.
And it's good that they are able to look at films like this and not see it as not see these people as somebody we see only in traffic signals, but
Yeah.
who could be, a family member, who could be a child, and accept when you see it as one of your own, then it's easier to accept,
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
you meet them outside.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sahil,
Thank you.
for this conversation and for making the film.
Thank you so much. It was lovely speaking to you.